Case number 1. The 37-year mystery. In 1988, the world was a very different place. Technology was limited, communication was slow, and forensic science was still in its early stages. When people disappeared back then, many of them were never found. Their cases quietly faded into forgotten filing cabinets, marked with a single devastating word: cold. This is the story of one such case, a mystery that remained unsolved for 37 long years, until science finally spoke louder than silence. She was a young woman in her early 20s, living a quiet and ordinary life. Friends described her as kind, responsible, and dependable. She wasn't involved in crime, drugs, or dangerous relationships. She had dreams, routines, and people who cared about her. There was nothing in her behavior that suggested she was planning to leave her life behind. That is what made her disappearance so disturbing. On the day she vanished, everything seemed normal. She spoke to people, followed her usual routine, and made plans for the future. She left her home expecting to return. But hours passed, then days, and she never came back. There was no goodbye note, no packed suitcase, and no sign that she had run away voluntarily. It was as if she had simply been erased. When her family realized something was wrong, they contacted the police. Investigators began treating the situation as a missing person case, not a crime. There were no signs of forced entry, no blood, and no witnesses reporting screams or suspicious activity. Her belongings were still where she had left them. Her disappearance made no sense. Police interviewed neighbors, co-workers, friends, and acquaintances. They searched nearby areas, checked hospitals, and followed up on every tip that came in. Some people believed she had left town. Others suggested she might have started a new life somewhere else. But none of these theories were supported by evidence. Every lead ended in a dead end. As weeks turned into months, hope slowly began to fade. Media coverage decreased. Investigators were reassigned. The case lost momentum. Eventually, it was officially labeled a cold case. For law enforcement, it became one of many unsolved mysteries. But for her family, time stood still. Years passed, birthdays came and went. Holidays felt empty. Every unknown phone call raised false hope. Her family never stopped believing that the truth would one day come out. They refused to accept the idea that she would simply disappear without contacting them. They knew her too well. Decades later, forensic science changed everything. DNA technology advanced rapidly. Investigators learned how to extract genetic material from even the smallest biological traces. Criminal databases expanded. And then came genetic genealogy, a method that allowed police to identify suspects through distant relatives rather than direct matches. Someone decided to reopen the case. Among the old evidence was a tiny biological sample that had once been considered useless. In the 1980s, there was no technology capable of analyzing it properly. But now, that single drop of DNA held enormous power. When it was tested using modern methods, it finally revealed something investigators had been missing for nearly 4 decades. The DNA did not match anyone in existing criminal databases, but it did partially match a distant relative. That single result changed the entire investigation. Genealogists began building a massive family tree, tracing bloodlines through generations. Cousins, second cousins, and extended relatives were all examined carefully. Slowly, the list of possible suspects narrowed. One name stood out. Someone no one had ever suspected. This individual had lived an ordinary life. No criminal record, no known history of violence, no obvious connection to the victim that investigators had noticed before. For 37 years, They had blended into society unnoticed. If not for DNA genealogy, they would have remained invisible forever. Police began discreet surveillance. They waited patiently, collecting discarded items, a cup, a napkin, a piece of trash. When the DNA from those items was tested, the results were undeniable. It was a perfect match. After 37 years, the suspect was arrested. There was no dramatic chase, no resistance, just a quiet moment where decades of secrecy finally collapsed. Faced with overwhelming evidence, the truth came out. The crime had not been carefully planned. It was an act of opportunity that escalated into violence. Fear led to silence. Silence lasted for decades. For the family, the arrest brought mixed emotions. There was pain, anger, and grief, but also relief. After 37 years of waiting, they finally had answers. They could finally stop wondering. They could finally begin to heal. This case proves something powerful. Time does not protect the guilty. Technology continues to evolve. And justice, no matter how delayed, can still arrive. A single drop of DNA was all it took to solve a mystery that once seemed impossible. For 37 years, the truth was hidden. But it was never gone.
Case number 2. The vanished family in the mid-1990s. A quiet town woke up to a mystery that would haunt it for decades. This was the kind of place where people trusted one another, where children played outside without fear, and where doors were rarely locked at night. Nothing ever happened here. That's why what occurred next left investigators stunned and residents terrified. One ordinary morning, an entire family vanished, without warning, without explanation, and without leaving a single clear clue behind. The family was well known in the community. They were not wealthy, not secretive, and not involved in anything illegal. Neighbors described them as polite, private, and predictable. They had routines, responsibilities, and future plans. There were no public arguments, no rumors of domestic trouble, and no signs that they were preparing to disappear. Their lives appeared stable, normal, safe. The last confirmed contact with the family happened on a quiet evening. Phone calls were answered. Lights were seen on in the house. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. But the next day, something felt wrong. The house was silent. Curtains remained closed. Cars sat unmoved in the driveway. By the second day, concern turned into fear. When relatives arrived to check on them, the scene was disturbing. Not because of what was visible, but because of what wasn't. The home looked untouched. Furniture was in place. Personal belongings were still inside. Wallets, identification, and important documents had been left behind. There were no signs of forced entry. No broken locks. No struggle. It was as if the family had stepped out for a short errand and never returned. Police were contacted immediately. At first, investigators considered the possibility that the family had left voluntarily. But that theory quickly collapsed. Adults don't abandon their lives without money, paperwork, or communication. Children don't disappear without leaving some trace. Nothing about this situation suggested a planned departure. Search teams combed nearby areas. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters scanned forests and open land. Investigators interviewed neighbors, co-workers, teachers, and friends. No one had seen or heard anything unusual. No screams. No arguments. No suspicious vehicles. The town offered nothing but silence. As days turned into weeks, rumors began to spread. Some believed the family had fallen victim to organized crime. Others suspected a secret dispute that had turned deadly. A few even whispered about cults or government involvement. But rumors are not evidence, and police had nothing solid to act on. The case slowly gained national attention. Media outlets questioned how an entire family could vanish without leaving a trail. Experts debated theories on television. Psychologists analyzed the family's behavior. Still, no answers came. The investigation stalled. Years passed, and the case grew colder. Detectives were reassigned. Witnesses moved away. Some passed on. Evidence, minimal as it was, remained locked away in storage. The house was eventually sold. New families moved in. Life continued, but the mystery never left the town. For the relatives of the missing family, time became a cruel enemy. Every year without answers deepened the pain. They refused to believe the family had simply chosen to disappear. There were children involved. Loving parents don't erase themselves from their children's lives. Something terrible had happened. They were certain of it. Decades later, a single anonymous tip arrived. At first, investigators dismissed it. Cold cases receive tips all the time, most of them false, mistaken, or driven by attention. But something about this one felt different. The tip referenced a remote location, far from the town, a place investigators had never searched thoroughly. Against the odds, police decided to take another look. What they found changed everything. Hidden in an isolated area was evidence that directly connected to the missing family. Items that had once been inside their home. Objects that could not have ended up there by accident. The discovery transformed the investigation from a disappearance into a homicide case. Suddenly, the question was no longer where did they go. It became who took them? Forensic teams worked carefully. Advanced technology revealed traces that had gone undetected for decades. Soil samples, fibers, and degraded biological material were examined using modern techniques unavailable in the 1990s. Slowly, a timeline began to emerge. Investigators realized the family had not vanished willingly. They had been betrayed. The focus shifted inward, toward people they knew. One individual began appearing repeatedly in the family's history. Someone close enough to gain their trust. Someone familiar with their routines. Someone who had been questioned briefly years earlier and dismissed. This person had lived freely for decades. When police brought them in again, the interview felt different. This time, investigators had evidence. Details only the perpetrator could know. Inconsistencies emerged. Stories changed. Pressure mounted. Eventually, the truth surfaced. The crime was not spontaneous. It was rooted in conflict, financial, personal, and deeply emotional. What began as a confrontation escalated into violence. And violence led to irreversible decisions. The disappearance had been carefully staged to look like nothing had happened at all. For years, the suspect had believed they had gotten away with it. They were wrong. Arrests followed. Charges were filed. The town finally learned the truth behind the silence that had haunted it for so long. The case that once symbolized mystery became a reminder of something far more chilling. Evil often hides behind familiarity. For the family's relatives, justice came late, but it came nonetheless. Knowing what happened did not erase the pain, but it ended the endless questions. They finally had answers. They could finally mourn properly. This case proved a powerful truth. Time does not erase guilt. Silence does not mean safety. And no crime, no matter how carefully hidden, is truly invisible forever. An entire family vanished, but the truth never did. Case number 3. The teen who solved the impossible in most cold cases. Answers come from seasoned detectives, advanced laboratories, or powerful databases. But sometimes, justice arrives from the most unexpected place. This is the story of a case that remained unsolved for over 2 decades until a teenager with curiosity, patience, and determination succeeded where professionals had failed. It is a reminder that truth does not always need authority. Sometimes it only needs persistence. The crime occurred in the late 1990s. A quiet suburban town was shaken when a young woman was found brutally murdered. The scene suggested violence, but there were no clear witnesses, no surveillance cameras, no immediate suspects. The town had never experienced anything like it. Fear spread quickly, and pressure mounted on law enforcement to find answers. Police worked tirelessly. They collected evidence, interviewed dozens of people, and followed every possible lead. Several suspects were questioned, but none could be conclusively linked to the crime. DNA evidence existed, but technology at the time was limited. The genetic profile was entered into databases, but no matches appeared. The case stalled. Months turned into years. The investigation slowed. Detectives moved on. The case became another unsolved tragedy. One more file locked away, waiting for a miracle. For the victim's family, time did not soften the pain. They lived with unanswered questions and constant frustration. They believed the killer was still out there, living freely. And they were right. More than 20 years later, something unexpected happened. A teenager, fascinated by unsolved mysteries, stumbled upon the case while researching cold crimes online. Unlike many who read these stories for entertainment, this teenager became obsessed with finding the truth. They studied old reports, newspaper articles, and public records. What they found disturbed them deeply. The case made no sense. The teenager noticed inconsistencies. Small details that didn't align. Missed connections. Overlooked patterns. While professionals had followed standard procedures, they had also been limited by the tools of their time. This teenager, however, lived in a different era, one powered by information. Using publicly available genealogy websites, the teenager began exploring DNA genealogy. They understood that even if the killer's DNA wasn't in criminal databases, relatives might be. It was an idea that had only recently begun reshaping cold case investigations. Slowly, carefully, the teenager built family trees. Hundreds of names, distant relatives. Cross-referenced ages, locations, and timelines. What detectives couldn't do decades earlier, a teenager was now doing from a bedroom computer. One family line stood out. It led to a man who had lived in the area at the time of the murder. Someone who fit the age range. Someone with a past that raised questions, but who had never been seriously investigated. The teenager didn't rush to conclusions. Instead, they gathered evidence, screenshots, documentation, logical reasoning. When they felt confident, they contacted law enforcement. At first, detectives were skeptical. A teenager solving a cold case sounded unrealistic. But when investigators reviewed the findings, they realized something extraordinary had happened. The research was thorough, the logic was sound, and the suspect deserved a closer look. Police reopened the case. Surveillance began quietly. Investigators collected DNA from discarded items. When the sample was tested, the result was undeniable. It was a match. After more than 20 years, the killer was identified, not by advanced police technology alone, but by the determination of a teenager who refused to accept silence as an answer. The arrest shocked the community. The suspect had lived an ordinary life. Neighbors described him as normal, quiet, forgettable. No one suspected them. That is often how monsters survive. During questioning, the suspect initially denied everything. But evidence doesn't lie. Faced with overwhelming proof, the truth emerged. The crime had been impulsive, a moment of violence that changed countless lives forever. For the victim's family, the revelation was bittersweet. Justice had finally arrived, but far too late. Still, they expressed gratitude to the young person who refused to let their loved one be forgotten. This case sent shockwaves through the true crime world. It proved that cold cases are not just puzzles for professionals. It showed how technology, curiosity, and compassion can combine to achieve justice. And it raised an unsettling question. How many other cases are still waiting for someone brave enough to look closer? The teenager never sought fame. They didn't do it for recognition. They did it because they believed the victim deserved answers. And because of that belief, a killer was finally exposed. This case is proof that the truth does not care about age, titles, or authority. It waits patiently until someone is willing to listen.